Welcome back to the last equation of Elias Varr. Before we proceed, where in the world are you watching from? Please comment on your country location, and possibly the time zone too. It's always amazing to get to know the different ends of the earth we are connecting from. Now, the last time we met in this sleep story, we tiptoed into the strange, half-finished world left behind by a mathematician, whose pages are filled with more silence than answers. Tonight we'll open his notebook again, not to solve the mystery. Heavens no, that would require both coffee and a considerably sharper pencil, but to drift alongside it. You'll find stray symbols, empty margins, and a final page so empty, it almost dares you to stare at it for too long. This is not a story of breakthroughs. It's a story of pauses, false starts, and thoughts that trail off into the distance. Which, if you're here to sleep, is exactly the kind of mathematics you need. So let's return to Elias Varr's unfinished equation, and let the quiet between the lines carry you gently into the night. The room waits in its own silence. It is not an empty silence, not a hollow one, but a silence that has been lived in for years, settled into every corner like a soft, invisible fabric. The air holds the faintest trace of paper and ink, the dust of chalk, the thin, brittle smell of old wood. Evening has laid its hand across the study, and the light that comes in through the tall, narrow window is not bright, but muted, like light remembered, a haze that smooths the edges of things rather than defining them. The shelves along the walls lean slightly with the weight of their contents. Books pressed together, their spines faded and uneven, some titles barely legible, some cracked open just enough to suggest they were never fully closed. The shelves do not gleam, nor do they boast, they simply endure, as they have endured for years, carrying the burden of thought, of pages filled, of arguments recorded and abandoned. The dust here is not careless neglect but a record of quiet constancy. The air is heavy with stillness, though not stagnant. It has the feel of breath long held, of a mind in pause. There is a hush that is not quite emptiness but expectancy, as though the room itself is remembering something, or holding something in trust. The evening deepens outside, but here, within, time seems unhurried. Shadows stretch but do not rush, dust motes drift but do not fall. The quiet room is a vessel, and in its quiet, something waits. The desk stands near the center of the study, though not exactly centered, pushed a little closer to the window, as if Elias wanted the natural light to fall upon his work. Its surface is broad, but the years of use have left it uneven. The wood is scratched in places, smoothed in others where hands have rested again and again. Some scratches are faint, accidental, the kind that comes from a pen nib dragged too forcefully. Others are deeper, as if Elias pressed hard into the wood while thinking, while pausing with quill in hand, and an unsettled thought in his mind. Across the desk lies a collection of small objects, each of them quiet in their presence, yet speaking of the life that has touched them. An ink bottle, half empty, the rim stained with dark residue that has dried in irregular rings. A second bottle, stopped with cork, long since evaporated, and leaving only a dark crust at the bottom. A quill, its feather dulled and fraying slightly at the edges, lies across a stack of papers, not arranged neatly but left as they were used. Tilted, crooked, some overlapping others, as though order was less important than immediacy. There are scraps of parchment filled with notes, some no larger than a hand, some only carrying a few lines, abandoned mid-thought. Margins hold faint arithmetic, small clusters of numbers, like fragments of a tune hummed to oneself and left unfinished. Other pages are filled with dense writing, columns of symbols and words pressed close together, crowding the paper, every inch of space taken up. At one corner of the desk sits a candle holder with a stub of wax clinging to its base, long since burned low. The wax has dripped in hardened rivulets across the metal, pooling slightly where it cooled. The smell of old wax lingers faintly, though it is now only a memory of fire, not the fire itself. The desk does not gleam, it does not shine, it accepts the disorder laid upon it, and in that disorder there is a certain rhythm. Each object holds its place, not by design, but by habit, by the unconscious arrangement of a mind absorbed in something else. To look upon the desk is to glimpse a kind of landscape, not the kind with trees and rivers, but a landscape of thought, where peaks and valleys are formed not by soil or stone but by pages, lines and ink. And among it all, resting almost quietly, as though it wishes not to call attention to itself, is a single notebook. Its cover is dark, its edges softened by touch, the corners worn into gentle curves. It is not centered on the desk, not placed with ceremony, but rather left slightly askew, as if Elias had set it down with the intention to return, and simply never did. The notebook waits. Its silence is different from the silence of the room. The room holds its silence like a vast container. The notebook holds its silence like a secret. The notebook rests as though it has been waiting for years, though perhaps it has only been days, or hours. Time, in this room, does not pass in the same way it does outside. Here, the minutes elongate, stretch and blur, so that it is difficult to say how long anything has truly lingered. The notebook carries that same quality, of waiting without urgency, of existing without the need for measurement. Its cover, once smooth, now bears the wear of countless hands. The leather has softened, the edges darkened from years of touch. Tiny cracks run along the surface, not sharp or sudden, but delicate, almost like veins on the back of a hand. Where the leather folds at the spine it has loosened, the lines of pressure clear from the many times it was bent open and bent closed again. If one leans close there is a faint scent, the dry, earthy smell of old leather, mixed with the sharper note of ink that has seeped into the fibers over time. It is not an unpleasant smell, but rather one that seems to invite memory, as though the air itself remembers the hours Elias spent bent over these very pages. The pages inside are uneven, some slightly curled at the corners, some pressed flat, others swelling faintly where ink had once soaked deep. Along the edges the paper has grown darker, not with dirt, but simply with the slow passage of time. Each page has absorbed the air of the room, the faint moisture, the dust, the weight of years. Even without being opened, the notebook feels dense with presence, as if every line of ink within it continues to press outward, still alive, still resonant. When the notebook is touched, or even imagined being touched, there is a subtle sense of resistance, as though it prefers to remain closed. Not hostile, not forbidding, but secretive. To lift the cover would not simply reveal words on a page. It would disturb the long silence that has settled here. Yet from the way the notebook sits, slightly askew, almost casual, it also feels as though Elias had not finished with it. It is not stored away carefully, not tucked onto a shelf. It lies where it was last used, waiting in plain sight, as though the hand that placed it down expected to return at any moment. That expectancy lingers. The room itself seems to bend toward it, gently. The air gathers around it, the silence thickens where it rests. It is a silence not of emptiness but of holding. Something is inside the notebook. Something not yet fully spoken, not yet fully known. The equation, or the shadow of it, or the thought that gave birth to it. And so the notebook remains, a quiet center in a quiet room, a weight that is not heavy, and yet presses inward with its own gravity. The sense of waiting does not fade. It only deepens. Before the equation itself can be considered, there is the matter of the hand that shaped it. Elias Varr's handwriting is unlike any other, and to look upon it is to look not only at words, but at the gestures of a mind. It is not simply ink on paper. It is movement, rhythm, pressure, hesitation, and release. The letters loop in ways that seem both deliberate and restless. Some are elongated, stretched far beyond their usual form, as though his thought had not yet reached its conclusion by the time the pen had passed. Others are cramped, pressed too tightly, inked into small corners of the page as though he were trying to save space, or trying to squeeze an impossible amount of thought into too little room. There is a particular irregularity to his strokes. One line may be crisp and confident, each curve sharp, each mark decisive. The next may falter, hesitate, almost stumble across the paper. It gives the impression of a hand pulled between two forces, the urgency of ideas that demanded to be written, and the weight of uncertainty that slowed their passage into words. Some letters tilt forward as if rushing toward completion. Others lean backward, cautious, reluctant, as if uncertain whether they should appear at all. Even within a single word, one can see this shifting. Speed and slowness combined, eagerness and hesitation sharing the same space. And yet, despite this irregularity, there is beauty. The handwriting is not polished, not elegant in the sense of perfect calligraphy, but it has a kind of life within it. Every uneven curve, every elongated stroke, every cramped corner speaks of a hand, attached to a restless mind. It is handwriting that feels alive, always moving, always searching. The ink itself adds its own voice to the page. In some places, it lies thick and black, pooled where the quill pressed hard, as though Elias had written with sudden force. In others, the lines are faint, almost faded, as though the ink had run thin, or the pressure of his hand had eased away. These variations create a landscape of tone and depth, dark peaks of certainty and pale valleys of doubt. To trace the letters with one's eyes is to follow not just the words but the very rhythm of Elias's thought. One can almost sense the moment where his hand paused mid-word, hovering above the page, uncertain of what came next. One can almost hear the faint scratch of the quill resuming its path, hurried or slow, according to whatever thought broke through the silence of the moment. This is not merely handwriting, it is a portrait, and in each letter, in each curve of ink, the portrait of Elias Varr continues to breathe. To imagine Elias at work is to imagine a rhythm. His writing was never continuous, never a steady line of ink unbroken across the page. It came instead in waves, periods of sudden movement followed by long pauses, like breath caught and released again. When he wrote, the quill moved quickly, almost furiously at times, as though his hand was racing to keep up with the thoughts pressing forward inside him. The scratches of the nib across the paper were sharp, almost urgent. Lines of symbols would spill out, one after another, each following in quick succession, linked not by neatness but by necessity. In those moments, the desk itself seemed alive with sound. The faint rasp of ink across parchment, the shuffle of a sleeve brushing against the paper, the creak of wood as he leaned forward. And then, as suddenly as it began, the motion would halt, the quill would lift, and silence would descend. Elias would sit back, quill suspended in the air, a single drop of ink, swelling at its tip, threatening to fall, but not yet released. The silence of those pauses was heavy, filled with thought. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. The room itself seemed to pause with him, as though caught in the same hesitation. The pauses could last for seconds, or for minutes, long enough for the ink at the tip of the quill to thicken, darken, and sometimes to fall, leaving a stray blot on the page. Small, imperfect circles that told of the moments when thought and action drifted apart. When the writing resumed, it was rarely in the same mood. Sometimes the next line came slowly, carefully, each stroke deliberate, as if Elias were testing the ground beneath his own ideas, uncertain whether they would hold. Other times the pen leapt back into motion, rushing forward again, the letters growing looser, less controlled, as if the act of stopping had made the thought all the more urgent once it returned. The rhythm was unpredictable but strangely consistent in its unpredictability. Like waves at shore, no two identical, yet each part of the same endless motion. Quick, restless bursts of ink, long waiting silences. A pattern that was neither order nor chaos, but something in between. An equilibrium of uncertainty. To watch the rhythm of his hand is to see not just a man writing, but a mind in dialogue with itself. The ink is not merely text. It is the record of struggle, of urgency and delay, of thought resisting its own capture. Every page carries this rhythm, and every pause is as eloquent as every word. It is in the margins that Elias Varr seems most human. The main lines of his writing, the equations, the long passages of reasoning, the neat attempts at structure, carry the outward purpose of his work. But the margins are where his mind wandered, where thought spilled sideways, unguarded, almost private. At first the markings seem accidental, small smudges where the side of his hand brushed the page, faint stains of ink where a quill was set down too carelessly. But on closer inspection, there are patterns. In the wide borders of parchment, there appear little arrows, drawn hastily, connecting one line of thought to another. Some arrows stop halfway, pointing toward nothing, as if his mind had leapt ahead and the ink could not keep up. There are words too, single ones, scrawled in the corners. Sometimes they are in Latin, sometimes in his native tongue, sometimes just a string of letters that do not seem to belong to any language at all. They might be shorthand, or fragments of thought, or even sounds caught as they passed through his mind, syllables half-formed, left to rest where they fell. Many are crossed out, as though Elias had been embarrassed by them, or had changed his mind before they could settle into meaning. And then, there are the doodles. Tiny spirals appear, drawn absently in the corners. Some are tight, wound into neat coils, others loose, sprawling, their curves broken where the quill had run dry. At times he drew triangles nested within triangles, or circles within circles, shapes repeated with small variations, as if testing something unseen. These small geometries, idle as they seem, mirror the great structures within the heart of his equations, as if his hand could not help but return to them, even in moments of distraction. Occasionally a margin holds a line that seems almost like a private note to himself, "Not yet," or "Too soon," or "Look again." These brief phrases, when read now, seem to hover at the edge of comprehension, cryptic instructions, as though he were not only writing to his present self, but also to some future self, who would return to these pages, searching again for meaning. Some margins are empty, but even the emptiness feels deliberate. White space pressed against dense writing creates its own kind of tension, like silence beside speech. The unwritten margins feel as though they have been kept clear for thought too large, too unformed to be put into words. To trace these marginalia is to follow Elias not as a mathematician, but as a person, restless, distracted, uncertain, curious. The margins reveal not the equation itself, but the living presence of the one who pursued it. And in those faint arrows, those odd doodles, those scattered words, It is possible to sense the quiet companionship of a mind circling its own mystery, never quite arriving, but never ceasing to move. The margins breathe. They are Elias's pauses set into ink. They are his half-steps, his half-thoughts, his wanderings. And in their quiet way, they may hold more truth about him than the careful lines in the center of the page. The first time one notices the symbols, they hardly seem like symbols at all. They appear at the edges of ordinary writing, as if they had slipped in quietly, unnoticed, between the letters of familiar words. To an untrained eye, they might even be mistaken for mistakes, stray marks where ink spread too quickly, or a quill caught at the paper's grain. Yet the more one lingers, the more deliberate they appear. The shapes do not belong to any single system. They are not letters in the usual sense. Nor are they numbers, though they borrow something from both. At times they curve like alphabets, looping and flowing as if meant to be spoken aloud. At other times they stand rigid, sharp-angled, like the dry scaffolding of geometry. Some combine both qualities, fluid lines crossed by stern diagonals, a union of motion and stillness. One symbol resembles a spiral, but it is not the neat spiral of a shell or a coiled rope. It falters midway, breaking apart into a sudden straight line, as if Elias had begun with one intention and ended with another. Another symbol resembles a triangle, but its sides are uneven, one angle wider than the others, its base unstable, as though it were never meant to stand upright. There are lines that loop back upon themselves, creating shapes that are both complete and incomplete, whole yet unsettled. They are not drawn carelessly. Even when asymmetrical, even when broken, there is a consistency in the pressure of the ink, the steadiness of the strokes. They were made with decision. Each one, whether simple or strange, seems to have been placed with thought behind it. The symbols do not apologize for their oddness. They exist, unapologetic, self-contained. When seen together, they do not form words, nor do they form equations in any recognizable sense. They cluster loosely, a gathering of forms, each one distinct, yet bound together by the same hand. They give the impression of belonging to a language that exists just beyond reach, a language one almost recognizes, almost recalls, but cannot quite name. And there is something more. Something in the way the shapes rest upon the page suggests that they are not simply meant to be read, but to be seen, to be lingered upon with the eyes. Their presence is not merely functional, not merely the stepping stones of logic. They are visual, almost ornamental, like patterns meant to be gazed at slowly, not hurriedly consumed. To look at the first symbols is to feel that one is looking at the boundary of understanding, not quite inside, not quite outside. The threshold of a room where the door has been left slightly open, but not enough to pass through. The symbols wait in their quiet clusters, and the longer one looks at them, the more they seem less like accidents and more like intentions. They do not rush to reveal themselves. They are content to remain, strange and patient, at the edge of comprehension. The longer one lingers over the symbols, the less they resemble mathematics at all. They begin to take on the quiet familiarity of shapes found in the world beyond paper, as if Elias had drawn not from a textbook but from the sky, from stone, from water, from memory. One cluster of marks resembles the stars. Not an exact constellation, but the impression of one. The way small dots and faint lines, when seen together, suggest patterns across the night sky. Some of Elias's symbols curve toward one another, like stars linked by invisible cords, tracing figures that could be animals, or tools, or nothing at all. In their spacing, in the quiet rhythm between them, there is a resemblance to the act of stargazing. searching the sky for order, finding it, losing it again. Another set recalls spirals, not the perfect spirals of geometry, but the living spirals of the natural world. One symbol echoes the slow curve of a snail's shell, drawn tight at the center and widening outward with a hesitant hand. Another unfurls like the curling tendril of a vine, thinner at its end, thick at its base, as though it could almost move, almost grow. Elsewhere, the lines bend into angular forms, triangles that lean, quadrilaterals that refuse to close properly, polygons with sides that stretch or collapse, resisting the crisp certainty of geometry. They are shapes in dialogue with imperfection, as if Elias wanted to capture not the idea of form, but the experience of it. Shapes as they are seen in nature, never flawless, always shifting. There are marks that resemble waves, curves rising and falling, like the gentle undulation of water. Others are jagged, as though mimicking the edge of a mountain range or the crack of lightning. A few are delicate, so faint they seem almost transparent, as if Elias had tested his quill lightly against the page, sketching not for permanence but for possibility. Taken together, the symbols resemble a natural archive, as though Elias had been less a mathematician than a collector of forms, snippets of the world, pressed into the paper like dried leaves. They seem to live somewhere between order and chaos, structured enough to suggest meaning, free enough to resist being bound to any one interpretation. Looking at them, one might feel a kind of double vision. On one level they are lines of ink, nothing more. But on another, they seem to shimmer with resemblance, to stars, to shells, to rivers, to landscapes. They hover between abstraction and recognition, between symbol and image, between what is written and what is remembered. And perhaps that was Elias's intention. Not to write symbols that could be solved like an equation, but to write symbols that could be seen. Shapes that, like constellations, reveal something only when the eye lingers long enough to let them emerge. The more one studies the symbols, the harder it becomes to think of them as static. They do not sit on the page passively, as words do, waiting to be read. They carry a subtle energy, a quiet insistence that they are more than they first appear. Some seem to resist being looked at for too long. The eye drifts from them, as if they prefer not to be pinned down, slipping out of focus like a star at the edge of vision. Others, by contrast, seem to hold the gaze too firmly. Their angles pull the eye inward, circling back again and again, as though they possess a gravity of their own. In this way, the symbols begin to feel less like writing and more like behavior. They act, they lean, they pull, they scatter, they gather. The spiral does not only resemble a spiral, it behaves like one, drawing the gaze inward, curling tighter with every return. The jagged mark does not only look like a mountain ridge, it resists the eye, interrupts its motion, demands a pause before moving past. When several are placed together on the page, they interact. A curve drawn beside an angular mark seems to soften it, as though balancing its sharpness. A cluster of dots near a broad line seems to orbit it, like planets about a sun. Even the empty space between them feels charged, not void, but the silent stretch of tension, like the distance between two magnets that do not quite touch. The symbols seem to hum, not audibly, not with sound, but with the kind of quiet vibration that one senses rather than hears. As though beneath their ink, beneath their form, something continues to stir. They suggest a language not of words but of forces. A language of gravity and tension, of attraction and repulsion, of motion suggested within stillness. Perhaps this is why Elias drew them. Perhaps they were not attempts at communication in the ordinary sense. but attempts at capture, to pin down behaviors, to translate the invisible patterns of the world into marks on a page. Not symbols as labels but symbols as enactments. And yet, for all their strange vitality, they remain incomplete. They suggest much, but declare nothing. They gesture, they beckon, they hint, but they do not resolve. To study them is to feel always on the edge of comprehension, suspended in that narrow space between recognition and mystery. They live on the page, but they refuse to settle into final meaning. It is said that Elias Varr rarely sat still for long. Writing was not, for him, a stationary act. The pen could not move without the body moving too, as though thought itself required motion to take shape. He would rise from his chair in the midst of a calculation, walk to the far side of the study, pause with his hands clasped behind his back, then turn and retrace his steps, the same path again and again. The floorboards bore witness to this. Certain planks had dulled to a softer sheen, not from polish, but from the countless passes of his feet. A faint groove had formed, where his boots struck the same line across the wood. A path carved not by tools but by habit. The boards creaked differently along this line, less sharply, more resigned, as though they had grown accustomed to his weight. The act of pacing was not hurried. Elias did not stride with agitation, nor with the restless energy of a man seeking distraction. His steps were measured, deliberate, like the ticking of a slow clock. Each step was followed by a pause, as though he were listening, not to the room, but to the rhythm of his own thought. At times he would stop in mid-path, standing perfectly still, the silence of the room deepening around him. His gaze might fix upon the shelves, or upon the candle flame, or upon nothing at all, eyes unfocused, mind turned inward. Then, after long moments, the rhythm would begin again. Step, pause, the sound of leather brushing wood, the weight of a body moving not forward, but in circles, tracing and retracing the same narrow ground. For Elias, the desk was not enough. Thought required motion, and pacing became its own kind of instrument, like a metronome keeping time for the unfolding of his ideas. Each return to the desk carried with it a residue of this rhythm, as though the ink itself was drawn out in measure with his steps. The room, in turn, seemed shaped by it. The air within the study felt trained to expect motion, as though silence itself leaned forward, listening for the next footfall. It was a silence not of stillness, but of anticipation, stretched across the slow, predictable beat of Elias Varr's pacing. The floor beneath Elias's steps has become a kind of ledger in its own right, recording not words but the repetition of motion, the insistence of habit. Each board tells a story, though none of them are written in ink. They are written instead in pressure, in weight, in the quiet wearing down of wood over time. Along the path he walked most often, the planks have lost their sharpness. The grain is smoothed where boots passed again and again, the once clear ridges worn to shallow curves. The wood darkened too, not evenly but in subtle gradations, the faint sheen of polish where his soles brushed, the soft dimness where dust and shadow lingered untouched. The contrast is delicate, but undeniable, a faint trail across the room, visible only to the attentive eye. Some of the boards dip ever so slightly, bowed by years of use. Their creaks are familiar creaks, not random but rhythmic. The same notes sounded each time his weight shifted across them. One board at the center groans faintly, not in protest but in recognition, as though greeting a presence it has known for decades. The sound has become part of the silence here, a detail so ordinary it vanishes unless one listens for it. And there, near the desk, a faint mark, almost invisible unless the light falls just so. The scuff of a boot heel, pressed over and over in the same place, until the fibers of the wood bent inward. It is not a single scar but a layering of many, one upon another, the accumulation of pauses where Elias stopped, turned, hesitated. A single spot of stillness, multiplied by time, etched into the floor without intention, yet unmistakable in its persistence. The boards hold more than wear, they hold memory. To stand upon them is to feel the ghost of movement, the suggestion of countless footsteps lingering in the grain. Each pass across them was linked to a thought, each turn at the end of the path bound to some calculation begun or abandoned. They are the physical counterpart to the symbols on the page, marks of thought, drawn not in ink but in wood. One might imagine walking that same path now, following the faint groove, hearing the same sequence of creaks, step where he stepped, pause where he paused, turn where he turned. To do so is to borrow the rhythm of Elias's mind, to walk briefly in the shadow of his pacing. The boards, worn and waiting, make such an act possible. They do not resist, they remember. And in their memory, the quiet ritual of Elias Varr endures. To walk the path Elias traced is to enter into a rhythm that is not wholly one's own. The first step feels ordinary enough. The heel presses down, the sole follows, the faint creak of the board beneath sounding in response. But then comes the second, and the third, and with them a pattern begins to take hold. The body learns what the boards already know. The steps lengthen into sameness. Each one lands just where countless others have landed before, as though guided by invisible tracks set into the floor. The pauses emerge naturally, small hesitations after each movement, not planned but demanded by the rhythm itself. Step, then silence. Step, then silence. The air listens, the room adjusts. At first the pacing feels like walking, but soon it becomes something else. A kind of metronome, a pendulum, a slow and deliberate oscillation between here and there and here. The path itself dissolves into repetition, until the mind no longer notices the beginning or the end. Only the steady swing remains. With the repetition, thought begins to shift. Ideas drift closer to the rhythm of the body. The motion becomes a container, a framework, within which fragments of possibility begin to gather. One is not trying to think, not reaching for conclusions, only moving. And in moving, the space for thought opens, wide and unhurried. The boards creak in response, the same familiar notes repeating. They mark time in their own way, like the low drone of a background instrument, reminding the listener that the measure continues. Step, pause, step, pause. The mind begins to lean into the cadence, aligning with it, resting against it. And after a while the path feels less like one followed by choice, and more like one offered, as though the boards, the creaks, the pauses are conducting the body, nudging the mind into the rhythm that Elias himself once kept. His presence is not visible, but it is suggested, implied in the shape of the path, in the grooves underfoot, in the stillness that grows fuller with each turn. It becomes difficult to tell where the pacing ends, and where the thinking begins. The two merge, indistinguishable. A ritual of motion, a ritual of mind, sustained not by effort but by the gentle insistence of repetition. And in that repetition, one comes closer to Elias Varr, not through his words but through his steps, the silent arithmetic of his pacing. If the pages of Elias Varr's notebooks can be said to contain his work, then it is the margins that contain his wandering. The central text, the carefully aligned equations, the structured rows of symbols, seems to belong to one kind of mind, deliberate, orderly, precise. But the edges of the page, the empty spaces that might have been left blank, reveal another. Here the ink behaves differently. It sprawls, curls, hesitates. Tiny sketches appear, some geometric, others almost childlike. A spiral repeated 3 times down the side of a page, each iteration slightly larger than the last. A cluster of triangles, overlapping, shaded in with quick strokes. Circles that never close, their lines wavering, as though Elias's hand paused mid-thought and drifted away. At times, words appear too, not full sentences, rarely even complete phrases, but fragments. A single term written twice, once neatly, once again in smaller script, as though Elias tested its shape against the page. A phrase half crossed out, but still legible beneath the lines that attempt to erase it. Words borrowed from languages not his own, scattered in transliteration, hovering at the edge of comprehension. Even numbers find their way into these margins, though they do not belong to equations here. A sequence written downward, not solved but abandoned midway. A single digit circled heavily, pressed into the paper so firmly that it leaves an indentation, visible even on the reverse side of the page. As though Elias found something important in its form, not its calculation. The margins feel less like notes and more like echoes. They are the traces left when thought strayed from its appointed path, when attention slipped sideways into something looser, more fluid. They are not mistakes but byproducts, residues of the mind's motion, caught at the edges. In some places the ink is faint, as though written with a pen nearly dry, the mark hesitant, struggling for permanence. In others it is heavy, thick, the nib pressed hard, the movement decisive, almost impatient. These contrasts suggest moods, shifts in Elias's state of mind, captured without intention. The central writing strives for permanence. The margins betray the moment. To study the margins is to sense Elias in fragments, not as a careful mathematician, but as a restless presence. The edges reveal the humanness of the mind behind the work, its hesitations, its impulses, its distractions, its need to mark even what could not yet be explained. They are the whisper around the voice, the shadow around the figure, the gesture around the word. The margins hold not the answers, but the traces of the search. The drawings are small, so small in fact, that one might overlook them, if the eyes remain fixed upon the formal equations at the page's center. Yet once seen, they invite attention, pulling the gaze away from order and into curiosity. They are not art in any conventional sense, but neither are they meaningless. They sit in the threshold between idle mark and deliberate symbol, stubbornly undecided. The spirals appear most often. Some are tight, carefully wound, each loop spaced almost evenly from the next. Others are looser, the line wavering as though drawn absent-mindedly while thought wandered elsewhere. The spiral seems to fascinate Elias, for it repeats across many notebooks, each time slightly different, sometimes opening clockwise, sometimes counter, sometimes cut off abruptly mid-curve. It is as though he circled around something invisible, always close, never touching its center. Triangles, too, make their presence known. Not single ones but clusters. 2 joined at the base, 3 overlapping, 1 tucked neatly into another. Some are shaded dark, almost black with ink. Others left empty, the outline faint and incomplete. They suggest both structure and play, the basic shape of geometry pared down to its simplest, most stubborn form. A triangle needs nothing to be complete, yet here they multiply, accumulate, suggest relationships that the page does not explain. Circles linger too, though rarely are they whole. Often the hand seems to falter before closing the line, leaving a gap at the join, as though unwilling to enclose the figure entirely. A few contain smaller marks within them, a dot, a dash, a flick of the pen, that transforms them into eyes, or planets, or wheels, depending on the imagination of the viewer. None are labeled, none resolved. They remain unfinished gestures, half symbols, loose offerings to the edge of the page. Other marks are stranger still. Parallel lines that begin neatly, then collapse into jitter. Cross-hatching that fills no shape in particular. A patch of texture pressed onto the paper for no clear reason. Even what looks like the outline of a hand, traced not carefully but hastily, as if Elias had tested the size of his own palm against the paper, and left it at that, forgotten and unremarked upon. Taken together, these drawings form a silent counterpoint to the mathematics they accompany. Where the central writing aspires to precision, the margins dissolve into ambiguity. They are attempts without conclusion, shapes without destination. Yet in their persistence, one senses that Elias returned to them again and again. Spirals, triangles, half-circles, variations on a private theme, rehearsed in the periphery of his thought. They do not explain themselves, nor do they need to. Their value lies in their presence, in the way they soften the strictness of the central work, reminding the reader that behind the symbols lies a hand, and behind the hand a mind, drifting, restless, circling its own mysteries. The margins breathe differently than the rest of the page. Where the center holds itself taut, precise, determined to carry weight, the edges loosen. They are softer, lighter, more porous. To let the eyes drift there is to feel the shift immediately. The pressure of calculation dissolves, replaced by a quieter pulse. The mind at rest, or perhaps the mind wandering when it cannot rest. They carry a sense of hesitation, a line that begins boldly then falters midway, a word abandoned after 2 letters, a number written once, then again smaller, as though the first attempt was too loud, too certain. The margins become a record of doubts, of second thoughts, of starts that did not resolve. Not failures exactly, but pauses. Moments when thought lingered on the edge, unwilling to leap into clarity. They also hold distraction. Some marks seem to have no relation at all to the page they occupy. A tiny ladder, 5 rungs tall, drawn beside a formula about infinities. A rough sketch of a leaf, outlined in haste, its veins marked with quick flicks of ink. They belong less to mathematics than to idle motion, the kind of drawing a hand makes when the mind is elsewhere, circling an idea that refuses to be caught. Yet there is something soothing in this aimlessness. The margins remind us that thought does not move in straight lines. It drifts, loops, stalls, circles, returns. The central text shows the outcome of effort, but the margins preserve its wandering. Those stretches of uncertainty where nothing seemed to advance, but where the mind remained alive, searching. The ink itself tells of time passing. Some scribbles are faint, faded, the pen clearly nearing the end of its ink, lines weak and broken. Others are sharp and dark, the nib pressed hard, as if Elias leaned close to the page, intent on grounding himself through pressure alone. Even the texture of the strokes changes, some dry and scratchy, others smooth and wet. Tiny gleams of ink still visible, where the pen lingered longer than needed. Altogether the margins feel like whispers, the soft murmur surrounding the voice of the page. They are not declarations but murmurs, not solutions but fragments. And in them, perhaps, lies something truer than the polished work itself, a record of the mind, not at its most certain, but at its most human. The notebooks, then, are not only books of mathematics, they are books of wandering, of searching, of circling. To read them fully is not only to follow the equations, but to attend to the spaces beside them, the margins, where thought, restless and unfinished, quietly leaves its traces. Before one can even approach the ink on the page, one must imagine the light that made it visible. Elias Varr did not write beneath the bright fluorescence that now fills modern libraries. His pages belong to another illumination, the warm, uneven glow of flame. The candle rests low on the desk, its base weighted by melted wax pooled and hardened over time. The wick leans slightly, curved as though tired, its small flame bending and righting itself with each breath of air. It is not constant, not fixed. It quivers, it flickers, it shifts in brightness from moment to moment. The light it gives is alive, a moving presence that breathes across the paper. In this glow, shadows do not fall cleanly. They soften and stretch, edges blurred, shapes elongated. The notebook lies within a pool of light, its margins reaching outward into dimness. Beyond that, silence, obscurity, the room itself dissolving into dark. The candle defines the world, and the world is small: the desk, the paper, the hand, the flame. Ink reflects differently here. Where the nib pressed firmly, the line gleams faintly, catching the flicker of firelight, a silver thread that vanishes when the flame wavers. Where the hand wrote lightly, the strokes appear matte, almost absorbed into the paper. Reading by such light is a shifting act. The page never looks the same twice, each glance altered by the candle's movement. Time itself feels different beside a flame. Minutes stretch, soften, blur. The flame consumes itself slowly, almost imperceptibly, and yet with inevitability. Each drop of wax that slides down its side marks the passage of time, not in hours, but in its own quiet rhythm, the life of the candle. Elias must have known this, how the work was not only measured by thought, but by the length of a wick, the depth of a flame. The candlelight brings an intimacy to the page. The flame is close, the hand closer, the eye bends nearer to read, the body leans forward into the pool of light. All else falls away. What remains is the conversation between mind, paper, and flame. And in that narrow circle of illumination Elias Varr worked, his figures etched into the dim glow, his thoughts tethered to the fragile persistence of a single flickering flame. The flame does not hold still, it trembles, it leans, it flutters as if uncertain of its own shape. A breath from the room, so slight it might not even be felt upon the skin, passes through it and tilts it sideways, then just as quickly it rights itself again, wavering before resuming its upright stance. It is a small dancer, tireless, swaying endlessly at the center of the desk. The shadows respond to its every motion. Lines on the page stretch and contract, their darkness thickening and fading in rhythm with the flame's subtle sway. The edge of the notebook seems at times to vanish, then return. The quill or pen resting nearby is never still in appearance. Its shadow lengthens, bends, and breaks as though animated by the pulse of the flame. Even Elias's own hand, as he wrote, was reshaped constantly. Not one hand but many, elongated, foreshortened, fractured into silhouettes that came and went with the rhythm of fire. The page itself changes character in this light. A clean sheet looks textured, its fibers catching gleams that shift across its surface, as though the paper were breathing. Written lines alternate between sharp clarity and soft blur, depending on the flame's angle. Reading here is never a fixed act. Each sentence passes beneath the eye with a slightly altered face, as though the work itself wished to remain in motion. The flame gives a rhythm to thought. Where modern light insists on constancy, the candle interrupts. Each flicker nudges the gaze, slows the hand, or pulls the mind momentarily toward the play of brightness and shadow. In this way, the flame becomes a companion, an insistent, restless partner that demands to be noticed, even as one tries to focus elsewhere. There is a gentleness in this disruption. The shifting of light slows the work, compels pauses, allows the mind to drift into the spaces between symbols. To calculate by candlelight is to accept interruption as part of the process. The flame dictates tempo. Thought must move at the pace of fire, halting, resuming, circling back. And always, in the corner of vision, the flame reminds of time's passage. It is not a clock with numbers, not a bell with hours, but a dwindling of itself. Wax gathers, slides downward, pulls upon the desk. The wick grows shorter. The flame shrinks imperceptibly, yet steadily. One does not need to measure time by minutes here. One sees it in the flame's slow consumption, the gradual lowering of its glow. In this way, the candlelight does not merely illuminate Elias's work, it shapes it, bends it, enters into it. His equations, his symbols, his wandering in the margins, all of them existed within the breathing, flickering company of flame. Candlelight does more than reveal, it enfolds. It draws the world inward, gathering space into a narrow circle, and leaving all beyond to dissolve into darkness. Within that boundary a kind of solitude takes shape, not the emptiness of absence, but the stillness of containment. Elias sat inside that circle. The desk, the paper, the flame, these were his companions. Beyond them stretched only shadows, a room receding into quiet obscurity. There may have been shelves of books, a chair or two, perhaps a window, but in the presence of flame, they did not matter. The eye did not wander outward, it was held close, as though the universe had contracted to this desk and this light. The air carried the faint scent of burning wax, sweet, earthy, a little sharp. It mingled with the smell of ink, of paper, of wood warmed gently by the glow. Together they wove a presence both fragile and grounding, a reminder that this was no abstract space but a physical one, lived in through the senses. To breathe here was to breathe with the flame. There is an intimacy in such light, for it softens what it touches. Hard edges become blurred, rigid outlines waver. Even the human face appears gentler, shadows flowing over cheek and brow, lending the features a kind of quiet anonymity. If Elias ever glimpsed his own reflection in the window at night, it would not have been sharp, but a ghostly double. His figure lit from below, his eyes catching the shimmer of fire. The stillness of candlelight is not absolute, it quivers, it breathes. Yet within its small arena it creates an impression of permanence, a sanctuary against the vast dark beyond. The flame may falter, but it does not vanish easily, it persists, holding its small ground against the night, and in its persistence lies comfort. For Elias, this light must have become a rhythm of companionship. Each evening, the striking of a match, the soft flare of a wick, the first pool of brightness spreading across the page. Then hours of quiet work, sometimes fruitful, sometimes stalled, always accompanied by the same flickering presence. At last, the flame burning low, the room steeping itself in shadow once more. Thus the candlelight was not only illumination, but witness. It saw the slow unfolding of equations, the restless sketches in the margins, the moments of pause when the pen hovered but did not move. It bore silent company through the long nights, glowing gently over the fragile traces of thought that remained still upon the paper. Silence is never absolute. Even in the stillest room, the air carries its own quiet textures. Elias Varr worked not in complete absence of sound, but within a low murmur of small presences. each faint, each unremarkable, yet together forming the background in which thought unfolded. There was, first, the sound of his own work, the steady scratch of nib against paper, irregular yet persistent, rose and fell like a soft conversation. Sometimes the strokes were quick, short, like notes jotted in urgency. Other times they dragged, long and deliberate, as though the pen resisted the page. Between strokes lay pauses, the hush of a pen lifted, hovering, deciding. The candle itself made sound, if one listened closely, a faint crackle as the wick shifted, a nearly imperceptible hiss where wax met flame. At moments a tiny bubble of air trapped in the wax would burst with a quiet pop, gone as quickly as it came. These were the smallest of disturbances, but in the stillness they seemed large, distinct companions to the flicker of the light. The room too had its voice. Wooden walls and floors expand and contract with changes in temperature. At times a board gave a low tick, a slow creak, as though the house itself adjusted its posture. A shelf might sigh faintly beneath the weight of its books, a chair shift with the settling of its joints. These were not disruptions but reminders. The space was not inert but alive in its own muted rhythm. Even the air had presence. Inhaling carried a faint susurration, exhaling another. A draught slipping beneath a door might stir a whisper along the floor, just enough to tremble the flame and alter the shadows. In such conditions, the act of listening became part of existing in the room. Each sound magnified by contrast against quiet, each pause deepened by what came before it. Thus the silence of Elias's study was not empty. It was a chamber filled with small recurring notes, pen, flame, wood, breath, air. To sit there was to hear a composition without melody, a pattern without climax. It was a silence that contained, rather than excluded, sound. The hours of work were measured not by clocks but by the slow cycle of recurring sounds. They were not loud, not insistent, but they gave the night a pattern, a rhythm so gentle it almost went unnoticed, until one leaned into it. At intervals the candle shifted in its dish, wax loosening, sliding, dropping with a softened weight against the wooden desk. Each fall of wax was its own small announcement, marking time more softly than any bell. The hardened puddle at the base grew uneven, ridged, a frozen echo of each drip before it. Listening became a way of tracing the flame's progress downward, the slow consumption of light. The pen itself moved in seasons of sound. There were stretches of furious scratching, where thought seemed to tumble too quickly for the hand, and the page grew dense with marks. Then, just as suddenly, there came long silences, minutes where the pen rested idle, its tip glistening faintly, while Elias sat motionless in thought. These silences were not empty, they were filled by the weight of stillness, broken only by the shifting of breath, the faint brush of fabric when he adjusted in his chair. Beyond the desk, the house had its occasional sighs, a beam giving off a slow creak, a distant shutter knocking gently against its frame, the faint groan of wood that seemed to speak in its own language of expansion and rest. These voices never intruded. They came quietly, like reminders that the structure held, that the night extended beyond the pool of light, and the work of the desk. And outside there were longer rhythms still, the wind moving in slow tides against the walls, the occasional far-off bark of a dog, or a carriage rumbling distantly over uneven stones. These were sounds of the larger world, softened by distance, arriving only as faint vibrations, like memories of motion drifting in through the air. Together they shaped a layered silence, a silence that was not absence but presence, a silence that breathed, shifted and returned again, like waves rising and falling without end. Elias worked within this soundscape, his thoughts accompanied by its invisible music, his equations written to its slow, unhurried tempo. There comes a point in listening when the room itself seems to fall inward, as though every sound, however small, belongs to a single continuous breath. For Elias, working in such stillness, the boundaries between sound and thought blurred until each seemed to echo the other. The scratch of pen did not merely mark paper, it became the texture of thinking itself. The faint creak of wood was not an interruption, but a reminder of the body's own weight, the chair's companionship in long hours of sitting. Even his own breathing, rising and falling in the hush, seemed less a personal rhythm than part of the air that filled the room. This soundscape did not demand attention. Rather, it invited it, softly, gently, until the act of listening became identical with the act of being present. There were no sharp intrusions, no sudden ruptures, only the low continuity of noises so slight they passed at the edge of awareness. And yet it was this very subtlety that gave them power. They stitched the hours together without haste, without announcement. Within such stillness thought deepened, distractions fell away not because they were banished but because nothing arose to replace them. Time seemed less like a sequence of moments and more like a steady field in which ideas could float and settle at their own pace. The mind, relieved of hurry, found itself wandering with patience, circling symbols, pausing over equations, lingering in the spaces between. Silence of this kind has a peculiar intimacy. It does not feel empty, but inhabited by the faintest echoes of life, by the whisper of air and the pulse of the flame. To sit in it is to become aware of one's own presence in sharper detail, to hear the body not as a distraction, but as part of the room's continuity. Elias did not work alone. He worked with the hush, with the quiet, with the faint chorus of small sounds that kept him company. In this way the silence shaped the work as surely as the candlelight did. Equations were not written into emptiness, but into a field of sound so soft it steadied the hand and calmed the mind. Each page bore not just the marks of ink, but the presence of the room itself, the silence in which it was composed, the unbroken company of quiet. On the desk lay pages filled with lines of numbers, symbols, and steady arrangements of thought. Yet the eye, moving carefully across them, would not stop only at the center. Along the edges, at the borders of intention, there were other marks, quieter, smaller, but equally revealing. These were the margins, and within them, Elias Varr's presence lingered most humanly. Some of the marks were simple, short strokes of a pen where the ink had tested itself, dots where thought had paused, faint smudges from a hand resting too long in one place. These were not mistakes, nor were they deliberate. They were traces of process, the quiet debris of writing. They gave the page a kind of texture, a reminder that ideas are not transmitted cleanly, but carried through the friction of movement. In other corners the margins held words, single terms written quickly, as though they arrived suddenly and had to be placed somewhere before vanishing again. Some were abbreviations, fragments of notation, reminders to return to a thought left unfinished. Others were more enigmatic, words without clear connection, as though the hand moved faster than the clarity of purpose. There were sketches too, not elaborate drawings, but faint lines that curved or spiraled, shapes repeated in idle motion, as though the hand, seeking rest, traced patterns of its own. Circles shaded lightly, triangles nested within one another. At times, what might have been the suggestion of a figure, or perhaps only a flourish of the wrist. They filled space that was otherwise empty, the corners of the page becoming a field for drifting attention. The margins told a story different from the main body of the text. Where the equations sought precision, the edges revealed hesitation, distraction, the overflow of thought. They were less about certainty than about process, less about solution than about presence. In them we find not the finished idea, but the rhythm of Elias's hand, the meandering of his mind as it wandered near and far from the problem before him. To look into the margins is to glimpse not the mathematician as a thinker alone, but as a human presence, sitting at a desk, candle burning low, pen wandering where it pleased. The margins are the record of that wandering, faint but enduring, holding what escaped the neatness of the center. The center of the page carried the intention, the structure of symbols aligned carefully, the attempt at order that mathematics demands. But the margins, scattered with fragments and sketches, formed a second, quieter record. They were not planned, not consistent, yet they grew over time into something that resembled their own hidden text. When one page was placed upon another, and then another, a pattern began to appear. The main work advanced steadily, but the edges accumulated their own story. Here a small spiral repeated itself across several pages, each drawn with slight variation, as though Elias's hand returned to it in moments of drift. There a sequence of triangles, some shaded, some hollow, marching along the border of a calculation. Elsewhere, faint words, half legible, half lost in the fading ink, recurred without explanation. These marginal notes were not corrections, nor were they elaborations. They belonged to another layer of thought, parallel to the main one. Perhaps they came when the equation resisted, when the pen, unwilling to halt, sought instead to wander. Perhaps they arrived when the mind drifted, circling in silence, waiting for clarity to return. What made them curious was their persistence. To find one idle sketch might mean nothing. To find the same shapes repeating, page after page, spoke of something more, an unconscious rhythm that threaded itself through the work. The margins, then, were not random. They were the faint record of an undercurrent, a shadow path of thought, not fully expressed, but unwilling to vanish. In this way the margins became their own kind of manuscript, one that did not speak in equations, but in hesitations, in gestures, in repetitions without conclusion. They bore witness to the spaces between concentration and distraction, between clarity and pause. They told the story of how thought resists neatness, how it spills outward, finding its way even into places not meant to contain it. To read them is to follow Elias not at his most deliberate, but at his most human, restless, uncertain, leaving behind marks that were not answers but the traces of waiting. They are less the mathematics of a problem, and more the mathematics of presence, how a hand moves when the mind searches, how a page absorbs more than it was intended to hold. When the pages were turned slowly, one after another, a strange impression arose. At first it seemed only a trick of attention, a pattern found where none was meant. Yet as the margins revealed themselves in sequence, their fragments began to gather, as though the edges of the work had been speaking all along in a quieter voice. The repeated shapes seemed almost deliberate in their persistence. A spiral here, echoed again 3 pages later, then again further on, until the repetition suggested rhythm rather than chance. Triangles, always drawn in clusters, their tips aligned toward the center, as though pointing at something left unsaid. Words half-formed, written faintly, recurring like refrains. Some, turn beyond, never explained, never connected directly to the equations they accompanied. The margins did not announce themselves as a code, but they gave the impression of one. Not a cipher in the usual sense, but a logic of drift. A pattern born not from decision, but from the tendency of thought itself to circle, to echo, to return. They were the ghost architecture of the work. a structure too soft to claim intention, yet too insistent to ignore. It was as if two manuscripts lay on each page, the official one, measured and exact, and another, lighter one written in the gaps, whispering across the edges. Together, they told more than either alone. The equations revealed the deliberate reach for order. The margins revealed the wandering, the hesitation, the persistence of something not yet captured. Seen this way, the margins became less accidental and more essential. They were not merely the overflow of thought, but its other half, the places where Elias's mind, pressing against the limits of formality, left behind its shadows. They suggested that what could not be said directly had still found a way to mark the page. And so the margins stood as a parallel text, faint but steady, shaping the work not by solving it, but by surrounding it with its own quiet presence. They were the background hum of thought, the echo of the unfinished equation itself, an unfinishedness mirrored in the edges of every page. At the center of Elias Varr's pages lay the equation itself, not in the sense of a single polished line, but as a progression, scattered across sheets, advancing and halting, always reaching but never quite resolving. The most striking feature of these pages was not what had been completed, but what had been left undone. Symbols trailed off mid-stroke, as if the pen had paused in hesitation, or the thought had broken away before the hand could capture it. Parentheses opened without closing. Lines began confidently, only to waver and stop, leaving empty space where something was meant to follow. In places, a faint arc of ink suggested the beginning of a symbol that was never finished, abandoned before it found its form. These fragments gave the impression of breath caught in mid-inhale, of a thought suspended between arrival and departure. They did not feel careless. On the contrary, there was a strange precision even in their incompletion, as though the decision to stop was itself deliberate, or at least unavoidable. Some of the unfinished symbols were repeated across pages, each time halting at the same point, as though Elias's hand knew where it could not pass. Others varied slightly, as though searching for a shape that never quite appeared. Each carried with it the sense of something withheld, something just beyond articulation. The eye, moving over these half-forms, felt both frustration and fascination. They hinted at meaning but refused to yield it. They seemed to say, here, at the edge of language, the thought cannot be carried further. Yet their persistence suggested that this border was not a failure, but the very terrain Elias was intent upon exploring. In this way, the unfinished symbols became the true signature of the work. They marked the places where thought pressed against its own boundaries, where the hand could not follow what the mind glimpsed. They were less the remnants of an incomplete equation, and more the record of its difficulty, its refusal to be reduced into tidy form. To sit with the pages was to feel the weight of incompletion. The unfinished symbols did not simply belong to the paper. They extended outward, into the room, into the air itself. The silence between them was not empty but charged, as though each half-stroke had left a resonance that hovered long after the pen was lifted. The eye would return again and again to the same halting curves and unfinished parentheses. Each return only deepened the impression that the page itself was holding its breath. The gaps were not voids but pauses, spaces dense with withheld intention. It was as though something waited just beyond the line, something the hand could not quite bring into form, but which lingered insistently in the periphery of thought. Even the ink carried this atmosphere. Where the pen had faltered, the pressure of the nib was often heavier, leaving a darker mark at the point of stopping, as though Elias had pressed down unconsciously in frustration, or in an attempt to force clarity into being. The unfinished marks bore this intensity, traces of struggle compacted into a single halted gesture. Around these symbols the room seemed altered, The desk, the chair, the candlelight, all were ordinary, yet the incompletion gave them an added weight, a faint disquiet, as though the silence of the space conspired with the silence of the symbols. The ear thickened with the sense of something withheld. One could imagine Elias leaning over the page, pausing mid-stroke, pen suspended, eyes fixed on what could not yet be written. The room would grow still around him. The fire might crackle faintly, but the silence pressed harder, stretching longer, until the pen was set down, leaving the line unfinished. Each page became not only a record of thought, but of that stillness, that hovering pause, that refused resolution. The unfinished symbols, repeated across the work, gathered into a kind of atmosphere, a presence both unsettling and compelling. They were the visible remains of the invisible struggle, a record not of what was solved, but of what resisted solution. And in their refusal to close, they gave the equation its peculiar gravity, drawing the reader into the silence that surrounded them. When the unfinished symbols were viewed singly, they seemed like pauses, hesitations, marks left incomplete through interruption or uncertainty. But when gathered together, page upon page, another impression began to form. The incompletions were not scattered evenly. They clustered in particular places, as though drawn by some invisible symmetry. Curves broken at nearly the same angle, parentheses halted at nearly the same height, lines cut short just before closure, as though each stopping point, though unplanned, obeyed a quiet consistency. Seen this way, the unfinished marks resembled constellations. They were fragments, yes, but fragments that echoed one another, as though variations on a theme that Elias never fully played. What at first appeared as hesitation began to resemble intention, the outline of something larger, something not contained within any one page but spread across the work as a whole. It was not a message in the usual sense, not a pattern that yielded quickly to logic. Instead, it carried the suggestion of hidden rhythm, a kind of negative geometry written not by the symbols themselves, but by the points where they stopped, the absences linked together, forming their own map, a ghost equation running alongside the visible one. To linger on this impression was to feel that the unfinishedness itself had meaning. The refusal to close, the persistence of gaps, became a language of their own. Perhaps Elias had sensed that the equation could not be completed in the terms he began with, that its truth lay not in what could be written, but in the places where writing failed. Thus the unfinished symbols stood not only as interruptions, but as guides. They pointed toward something beyond, something left deliberately unresolved, so that the work itself might remain open, an invitation rather than a conclusion. And in their quiet repetition, they gave the equation its most haunting quality, the sense that it was alive, not in its finished form, but in its refusal to finish. The room itself seemed to lean into the incompletion of the work. Silence was its defining presence, not the silence of neglect, nor the silence of vacancy, but a silence that seemed alive, attentive, as if listening. The air held its stillness, with a kind of gravity. Dust motes floated without hurry, suspended in the slant of faint light, drifting so slowly that their movement seemed more like waiting. The walls, lined with shelves, bore the hush of long years, their wood-absorbing sound until even the faintest rustle seemed magnified. In that quiet, the ordinary details became heightened, the creak of the chair when shifted slightly, the faint scratch of the pen before it lifted into pause, the irregular crackle of a fire settling on itself. Each small sound entered the silence carefully, then dissolved back into it, as though the silence were not merely absence but a substance, a medium into which every noise was drawn. This stillness was not oppressive but contemplative. It carried with it the sense of a mind concentrating, of a thought held close, of a labor too fragile to withstand disturbance. One might imagine Elias in that hush, bent over his desk, his breath slow, his movements deliberate, as though he too were part of the silence, sustained by it. The unfinished symbols did not sit apart from this environment. They belonged to it, and the silence belonged to them. Each halting mark seemed to echo in the room, its pause resonating with the larger stillness. The page and the air were not separate. They folded into one another, so that to read the work was also to inhabit its atmosphere. The silence became more than background. It became another kind of margin, a space in which the work itself breathed, not with answers, but with the long persistence of questions. The silence in the room did not remain even. It thickened in places, like a fabric folded over itself, and thinned in others, like a veil drawn across an opening. Near the desk it was dense, as though years of concentrated thought had gathered there, settling invisibly into the wood. Around the shelves it seemed layered, woven from the long accumulation of books left unopened, their words sealed into the hush. It was not the kind of silence one could measure, nor the kind that followed sound. Rather, it was a silence with texture, a quality that shaped the space itself. By the tall window, where the dim light entered, the silence felt pale, stretched thin by the intrusion of the outside world. In the farthest corner where the shadows gathered most deeply, it felt heavy, pooling on the floor like water, unbroken and still. Even the smallest motions altered it. The lift of a page, the set down of a pen, disturbed it, only for a moment, after which it flowed back into place, restoring itself with quiet insistence. The silence was not fragile. It was resilient, almost deliberate, as though it had its own intention, its own way of holding the room in balance. Within this stillness, the unfinished equation seemed less a disruption and more a reflection. The silence mirrored its incompletion, its refusal to resolve. Together, they created an atmosphere that was not empty but suggestive, not peaceful in the usual sense but contemplative, charged with the presence of something just beyond expression. One could imagine sitting there alone, even without the pages, and still feeling that incompletion in the air, as if the silence itself remembered the unfinished marks, keeping their pauses alive. It was in this way that the room became more than setting. It became an extension of the work, a kind of secondary manuscript written not in ink but in hush, in the weighted texture of quiet that pressed gently against every surface. As the silence was allowed to linger, it began to reveal itself less as absence and more as structure. It was not simply that the room was quiet, but that the quiet arranged itself in forms, as though it had been laid out like architecture invisible to the eye, perceptible only in the way it was felt. Near the desk the silence rose like a column, steady and upright, bearing the weight of concentration. Around the shelves it gathered in arches, curving gently above the rows of books, enclosing them in a kind of hushed vault. In the corners it pooled heavily, like foundations, anchoring the space with density. Even the air between objects seemed shaped, stretched into invisible beams that held everything in relation. This architecture of silence was not rigid. It shifted subtly with the rhythm of the room, expanding slightly when the fire flickered, narrowing when a page turned, deepening when nothing moved at all. Yet its overall shape persisted, lending the space a stability that went beyond walls and wood. The unfinished equation belonged to this hidden structure. The pauses in its symbols seemed like echoes of the same architecture, openings where the silence had been written directly into the page. It was as though Elias had not only worked within the silence but had allowed the silence itself to become part of the work, shaping it as surely as ink and paper. To sit in such a room was to feel that one was enclosed not only by books and furniture, but by a vast, invisible edifice, arches of pause, corridors of stillness, chambers of breath held between thought and completion. The silence did not merely surround, it sustained, as though the work could not have existed without it. And so the equation lived not just in ink but in air, not just in fragments but in the architecture of quiet that bore them up. The silence was not background. It was part of the unfinished truth itself. The margins of Elias Varr's pages spoke almost as much as the symbols themselves. They were wide, generous spaces, left open around the dense fragments of the equation, as though the work required a border of emptiness to contain it. At first glance, these margins appeared untouched, white fields around the dark strokes of ink. But to linger on them was to notice the subtle traces they held. A faint smudge where a hand had rested too long. A shallow indentation from the press of a pen. The ink not flowing but the pressure leaving its ghost. Occasional dots, scattered as though Elias had tested the nib, or paused in distraction. These small marks gave the margins texture, turning blankness into something more alive. They were not mistakes, nor intrusions, but the residue of thinking. The small evidence that thought does not proceed only in lines, but spills into the spaces around them. In a way, the margins were the quiet counterpart to the unfinished equation, where the symbols strained toward expression, halting and incomplete. The margins simply received. They held what the work could not use, the overflow of effort, the pauses of the hand, the weight of time itself. One could imagine Elias leaning back, staring at those blank edges, not to escape his work but to find room for it, to let his mind rest in the emptiness before returning to the dense labor of ink. The margins then were not absence but necessary space, the silent perimeter where the work could breathe. And so, though they carried little ink, the margins belonged fully to the equation. They were its atmosphere, its surrounding air. Without them, the unfinished symbols would have pressed too heavily, with no relief, no space to fall back into. With them the page became not only writing, but landscape. Dark lines set against wide, pale fields of thought. If the main body of the page carried the deliberate labor of the equation, the margins held its murmurs. They were not empty, not entirely. Across the wide, pale borders, faint signs drifted like echoes, tiny marks, hesitant sketches, fragments of words abandoned before they became sentences. In one margin, a short vertical line repeated 3 times, as though Elias had tested his pen against the paper before continuing. In another, a spiral no larger than a coin curled itself into nothing, drawn absent-mindedly during some pause. Elsewhere, a single letter, an R perhaps, or perhaps only the beginning of one, stood alone, unfinished, a seed of language that never grew. These stray marks had no clear purpose. They were not part of the equation, nor even attempts at it. Yet they gave the sense of thought circling itself, of a mind unable to move in only one direction. They were the overflow, the scatterings of concentration that landed at the edges when it could not be contained. Sometimes the margin bore only the faint shadow of erasure. A line started, then scratched out, leaving behind a smear. Other times the marks seemed playful, as though made in moments of wandering. A small loop repeated until it darkened, or a faint rectangle, drawn and abandoned. They were not attempts at beauty, but they carried a certain intimacy, the kind found in notes, never meant to be seen. Taken together, these whispers at the edges formed a second layer of the manuscript. The central equation spoke of struggle, of incompletion. The margins, by contrast, spoke of restlessness and drift, of the mind wandering around its own perimeter. If the symbols at the center were the main voice, the margins were the murmuring breath behind them. One could imagine Elias glancing at these stray marks later, perhaps even forgetting he had made them, their presence so slight, so unmeant. Yet they became part of the record all the same. The margins carried what the main work could not: its hesitations, its distractions, its softer moments of inattention. And in this way, the margins did not merely frame the equation. They deepened it, reminding the reader that thought is never only what is written directly, but also the quiet traces left behind when the mind falters, pauses, or drifts. The longer one lingered on the margins, the less they seemed like borders, and the more they resembled open ground. They stretched wide around the equation, not merely containing it but giving it space, like fields around a solitary house, or like quiet air surrounding a voice. Their expansiveness held a quality that was different from the dense work at the center. The equation demanded concentration, every symbol pressed into place, each line bound to the next. The margins, by contrast, invited looseness. They were unclaimed, unburdened, places where thought could rest without the pressure of precision. It was here that the faintest gestures took on meaning. A dot, a scratch, the hint of a curve, each seemed to echo with more than it carried, precisely because of the openness around it. A single line drawn idly into the margin did not disappear into clutter. It lingered, almost luminous in its solitude, the blankness amplifying its presence. The margins also suggested time. They bore the slow rhythm of pause and return, the cycles of thought that did not move directly forward, but circled, wandered, hesitated. If the central work revealed Elias striving toward resolution, the margins revealed the long hours in which resolution failed to arrive. They carried not the sharp effort of breakthrough, but the broad, patient atmosphere of waiting. To read them was to sense a kind of parallel text, not written in equations, but in space. A record not of what Elias solved, but of how he dwelled in the act of trying, the pauses, the distractions, the little fragments of movement that arose at the edge of intention. And so the margins became landscape, a pale expanse where traces appeared and faded, where silence itself seemed written down. They were not separate from the equation but continuous with it, like the horizon is continuous with the earth. They framed it, yes, but they also sustained it, granting it room to exist within something larger. In this way, the unfinished equation did not stand alone in its density. It breathed into its surroundings, into the wide, pale spaces that bore its weight. And those margins, patient and unhurried, bore it quietly still. The last page of Elias Varr's notebook did not conclude. It simply existed, waiting, its stillness carrying a weight heavier than words could explain. Turning to it, one expected finality, some closing mark, perhaps even the resolution of what had come before, but instead, there was only the sense of arrival in a place unfinished, like a corridor that ended in open air. The sheet bore faint traces of use, but not much ink. Its surface was lighter, emptier than the pages before, the whiteness of the paper allowed to spread nearly uninterrupted. At the top, a fragment of line began, a curve, perhaps the start of a symbol, and then stopped, leaving only a small, incomplete gesture. Below it, nothing followed. The rest of the page remained silent. This silence was not like the silence of untouched paper, it was different. It held the residue of intent, the faint shadow of a hand that had hovered, the slight impression where the pen may have touched without marking, the sense of thought pressing forward but not taking form. It was a silence charged with absence, as though something was meant to appear and never did. To linger over the last page was to feel not an ending but a suspension, as if the work had paused mid-breath and never resumed. The other pages carried the weight of incompletion, yes, but they also carried fragments, symbols, the struggle of effort made visible. The last page carried only the echo of what could not be carried further. And in this way, it was perhaps the most eloquent of all, for what is unfinished speaks differently than what is complete. Completion closes, it seals. But the unfinished extends outward, leaving room for continuation, for speculation, for silence to speak where words do not. The last page of Elias Varr's notebook did not close the work. It opened it, in its own way, stretching the equation beyond paper, beyond ink, into the realm of what was left unsaid. The surface of the last page bore its own quiet record. It was not pristine. The years had softened it, dulled the sharpness of its fibers. Where earlier sheets were creased with the weight of ink, this one seemed thinner, lighter, as though spared from the full press of Elias's hand. Along its edges the paper had darkened slightly, touched by time and air. A faint wavering in the fibers suggested that it had been turned and handled, though less often than the others. The corners were bent inward, not sharply but with the slow yielding that comes from rest, as though the page had folded itself closer over the years. If one tilted it toward the light, shallow impressions emerged, tiny furrows left by the pressure of a pen that had pressed down without leaving ink. These ghost lines ran short, uncertain, broken. They did not coalesce into words or symbols, but their presence revealed that Elias's hand had moved here, even if no trace of ink remained. They were the afterimage of intention, marks not of writing but of hesitation, perhaps of fatigue. There was also the faint grain of the paper itself, its texture uneven beneath the fingertips, like an expanse of land seen from high above. Tiny flecks dotted its surface, darker against the pale sheet, as though small constellations had been scattered across it. All of this gave the page a presence beyond its emptiness. It was not void, not absence. It was charged, quietly, with the sense of having been touched and then left. The earlier pages carried the struggle of Elias's effort, visible and dense. This one carried only the impression of withdrawal, the final space where his thought had reached, and where it had faltered. In its silence, the page became more than a sheet of paper. It became a threshold. Not a conclusion, but the place where the work stepped away from itself, where effort ceased, leaving behind only the hushed remainder of what had not been written. The silence of the last page was not an ending but an opening. Its wide expanse seemed to dissolve into something beyond the confines of the notebook, as though the paper itself became horizon, unmarked, unbounded, waiting. To rest upon it was to feel the pause lengthen, the way a breath held too long transforms into stillness, the unfinished marks, the faint impressions, the pale openness. They did not speak of failure. They spoke of continuation, of a work that stretched beyond Elias's hand, beyond ink, beyond the fragile sheets that bore his effort. In this way, the last page was less a conclusion than an invitation. It invited the eye to wander across its quiet surface, to imagine what might have followed, to sense the unspoken movement of thought that had not reached inscription. It was as though Elias had stepped aside, leaving the equation suspended, not closed, so that it might exist elsewhere, in another form, in another mind. The surrounding emptiness gave weight to this suspension. The blank space did not erase what had come before. It carried it, held it gently, giving it room to breathe. The page became a vessel not of content but of possibility. And in this possibility lay a kind of peace. For the unfinished can rest more deeply than the finished, unburdened by the finality of closure. The last page did not resolve, did not answer, did not conclude. Instead, it lingered quietly, allowing the listener, the reader, to drift into its openness, to rest within its pale, unmarked horizon. Thus the notebook of Elias Varr did not end. It dissolved, like a line trailing into silence, like a thought that continues after speech has ceased. The equation remained, not solved, not erased, but suspended, alive in the margins, alive in the empty page, alive in the quiet that followed. And so we leave Elias Varr, his notebook closed, his last page resting in its unfinished silence. The work is no more complete than when we began, which is precisely the point, for in that open, unmarked space there is nothing left to chase, nothing left to solve, only the gentle hush of possibility left undone. As you drift now, let the unfinishedness settle around you like a blanket, the quiet of margins, the soft presence of pages left unwritten, the calm of knowing nothing needs to resolve tonight, only the rhythm of your own breath, steady and slow, filling the blankness with its quiet measure. And perhaps as your eyes grow heavier, you can imagine Elias's last equation not as an answer, but as a pause, an invitation to rest, to let the work trail off, just as you too are trailing softly into sleep.